On behalf of the Hawaii Council for the Humanities, we're so happy that you could join us today and be a part of this unique speaker series that is focused on looking at different Hawaii topics related to the theme of debate and diplomacy, successes, failures, and consequences, which is this year's National History Day theme that we are an affiliate of. In this speaker series, we'll be diving deeper to illuminate Hawaii's histories, stories, and people by its people. Also for this speaker series, we have created a Padlet with the presenters' PowerPoint presentations, resources, and where we'll be housing this video recording. It will also be on our highhumanities.org website if you want to go to the website later and share it with your students or anyone that you feel would benefit from watching this video. So without further ado, please let me introduce our speakers and community leaders for today's session. First, we have Joy Enomoto, she is a Kanaka Maoli educator, visual artist, and activist who lives on the slopes of Ho'ovaina, Oahu. She is a lecturer in the Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Kiai of Mauna Kea, and member of COA Futures. I have also known Joy for many years now as a graduate student and at UH, and have been fortunate to be inspired by her work as an artist and activist. Thank you so much, Joy, for sharing your amazing passion and wisdom with us today. And then next we have Dr. Mary Therese Perez-Satori. She's the interim director of the Pacific Islands Development Program. She has a BEd and PD in secondary social studies with a focus on Pacific Islands history, and an MEd in educational technology, and educational doctorate in professional educational practice. She's an affiliate graduate faculty of the University of Hawaii at Manoa and the USC Rossier School of Education. A native of Chamorro, Guahan, she is a community organizer and advocate for Pacific Islanders in Hawaii, co-organizer of the cultural events such as the annual Cultural Animation Film Festival, the annual Celebrate Micronesian Festival, and the Micronesian Women's Summit. Dr. Hattori is also an author, poet, public speaker, and philanthropist. On top of that, she is also the Hawaii Council for the Humanities Board Chair and has been champion of our Hawaii History Day program for many years now. This year, Mary is also sponsoring, in partnership with the Pacific Island Development Program, the new Dr. Jojo Peter Award, celebrating the excellent projects in Micronesian and Pacific Islander history. Also, look out for the existing PD3 workshop by PIDP. The announcement comes out via the DOE. We are very fortunate to be guided by her amazing and brilliant leadership that makes our work at the council more meaningful and connected to diverse communities in Hawaii. So thank you so much, Mary, for all of your dedication and heart for this work. Thank you. So now I will turn it over to Joy, who will be presenting on the rise of the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement. Thank you, Joy. The floor is yours.
Mahalo, Shannon. Aloha mai kako, kia ora, yakwe, hafade, holavinaka. It is a great honor, and of course there's a truck driving by my window right now, so I can't hear anything. It is a great honor to be invited to speak for the Hawaii Council for Humanities on this History Day. This is a movement that is very close to my heart. I'm really excited to talk about it today because it is a movement that should never be forgotten. And it hasn't actually gone away, but it had a particular moment that we're going to be looking at today that was incredible for literally changing the way the Pacific exists today. And it stopped so much sort of US militarism and imperial expansion and nuclear testing in the Pacific. And it's really, really insignificant for us to talk about that today. And it is also part of the blueprint of the climate change that we are living with now. And I think that we cannot forget that climate change, being human induced, actually has foundational steps first. And so now we talk a lot about climate change, but we forget that the nuclear legacy is actually quite the key player in that. It changed the ocean. I'm not going to say it just changed the Pacific. It changed the ocean and it changed the earth. And so for those who think that somehow testing in one body of water doesn't affect the other, I'm just going to quote Teresia Tewa saying that what happens to one part of the ocean happens to all parts of the ocean, right? It happens to another part of the ocean. So it's not just a Pacific issue. So please do not be under the delusion that this is not an American or Japanese or something, not somebody else's issue, right? As long as you're living on Earth so far, it's kind of a thing. So we're not really I'm gonna give a little brief history around some of the testing today, but I'm really gonna be looking at the movement around the organizing movement that built up in a grassroots way around it. I'm just gonna share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Okay, you guys can see that? Everyone can see that? Cool, cool. I'm glad you can see it. It's kind of weird for me. I can't really share the full screen because then I'll just lose everybody. So the Nuclear Free Pacific, let me just move to the next slide. On March 1st, 1954, despite weather reports that winds were blowing toward inhabited islands, the US exploded its largest above ground hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll, which severely contaminated hundreds of Marshallese people, 28 American weathermen, and 23 Japanese fishermen, with dangerous radioactive fallout. The 66 US nuclear bomb tests in the Marshalls have left a legacy of thyroid cancers, miscarriages, and other severe health problems for the people of the Marshalls. That is a direct quote from the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific in 1984 on March 1st, as they were celebrating Bikini Day, or the week, March 1st, the week of March 1st is annually commemorated as the bombing, the bombing of Castle Bravo in Operation Crossroads, which devastated the Pacific, but in particular devastated the people of the Marshall Islands and Micronesia. I showed this sort of series of photos because what happened just before the tests began is the US Navy came to the people of the Marshalls, came to the people of Bikini, and told them that they were going to be doing this great act of service for mankind. Now, these newspaper images here, this is actually from Life magazine. And this was actually in my master's thesis, right? They use the propaganda of photography. They use this language of the goodness for mankind to stop all wars, to convince those newly Christianized, right? Those Christianized Marshallese folks to believe that they were doing a service in the act of God, right? In the act of humanity. They use their humanity against them. They weaponized their humanity against them. And they moved them from their home, not telling them that they would never be able to return, not telling them that this bomb blast would remove an island from the surface of the earth, right? When you think about what you would do if you knew that one of our islands, especially here in Hawaii, if suddenly Ko'olave, right, Hawaii Island, right, Molokai was no longer on the earth, what that would do to your soul, what that would do to your spirit, what that would do for you as a people, right? And then after that, to have the fallout, right? The fallout being snow, what looked like snow, which was nuclear ash, right? Oh, and I just want to go back. You see this little photo right here that has it's right next to the beach. There's actually people on that beach. There's a boat there. There are actually people on that. Those were the precursor tests to Castle Bravo. This was before, this photo was actually taken before they announced they were going to be doing testing, right? So I want us to remember, there was some setup, there was some warnings. This is a really important photo, okay? This is in the US archives. and it predates their legitimate start of testing, of nuclear testing after World War II, like in 1946, okay? So they knew what they were gonna do. They knew what they were gonna do. And even in that Life magazine article, they knew that they were never gonna be able to return home. It's written in the article, but the people who were living there were not told that, right? And then they were taken to an island that was not like that, and that didn't work out, and they had to be moved again, okay? But going back to the day of this particular bomb, the fallout fell like snow. Children there had never seen snow. It fell in their hair and their skin, and there were severe burns. The US Navy waited 3 days to tend to those folks because they wanted to see what nuclear fallout looked like on the skin. This is an act of egregious violence, right? This study of seeing how nuclear testing works out is called Project 4.1. Okay, I need to actually add that to my resources because I forgot to add that because it's incredibly important in terms of understanding that this was deliberate stuff, folks. This wasn't like, oh, we didn't know it was gonna happen. If you know the wind shifted and you went ahead and bombed it anyway, that means that you're not really concerned about humanity in this, right? So, but that's just the US. The US bombs, continued to bomb, right? 66 tests, atmospheric and below water, right? Devastating the ecosystem, causing massive miscarriages among women, causing severe illness. That is exactly why, right, folks need medical attention when they come here. That is exactly why people come to Hawaii, because of this legacy, right? So I want us to always remember that people come here because of what the US Navy, what the US chose to do to a group of other Pacific people, okay? To our people, right? These are to our Pacific folks. But that's just the US. I'm just getting started. The UK and the French were really invested in this. In the South Pacific, in French Polynesia, what's so-called French Polynesia, the French tested 193 nuclear, atmospheric, and ground bombs, right? They did not stop testing until 1993. Actually, was it 93 or 96? I need to double check that. Actually, 96, I take that back, it's 1996. Let me just correct that real quick while I'm here. 1996, okay? They will not apologize to this day. They will not apologize for the devastation that happened from 193 tests, okay? The time in which the heyday of testing is post-World War II, right? The good war, right? Post-World War II, and going into, right? We're going into the 1970s. You're looking at the start of Vietnam. You're looking at the decolonization of the Pacific, where organizing around independence and decolonization is incredibly important. Decolonization being the return of your country, right? For your own self-governance. So when we talk about nuclear free and independent Pacific, we are going to be talking about a set of people throughout the region who were organized to not only stop nuclear testing, not only stop wars, but demanding control of their own countries so that they can make sure these things don't happen, right? To make sure that nuclear testing doesn't happen, right? Let me just roll into this organization called ATOM, right? And I'm going to be showing you, there's not a lot of slides, but there's the role that women play in the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement cannot be underestimated. It cannot be underestimated. They are the most significant leaders in this movement, from from Kanaki to Aotearoa to Australia to Micronesia, right, to Hawaii. They are the big guns in this, okay, so to speak. That's an inappropriate word. Not the big guns. They are the big, they're the big players in this, okay? So ATOM, which stands for Against Testing in Mururoa, Committee of Fiji, it was created in, it was basically like this. In May 28th, 1970, folks from the Fiji Young Women's Christian Association, the Fiji Council of Churches, students from the University of the South Pacific, right, in their student association, they sponsored a meeting of 600 people to protest French nuclear testing in the South Pacific, okay, and the pollution and the dumping, right? And they basically asked, like, they were asking themselves, is a nuclear-free Pacific possible, right? The following month in June, the creation of ATOM, right, Against Testing in Mururoa Committee of Fiji, was created. And there was elections, right? So the people who run it were two biologists from USP, were two of the key players. A biologist named Graham Baines was elected as chairperson, and the secretary was Suliana Siwatibao, which is who you see here. This was in 1974, right? In 1973, they had gotten together and done like a little mini conference, and they just asked, like, can we do, is a nuclear-free Pacific possible? And they basically said, yes, a nuclear-free Pacific is possible. Now, what I love about these early formations, what I love about the organizing in the 1970s and 80s, is there's nobody's trying to look slick. Nobody's trying to worry about whether or not they have the right t-shirt on. Nobody's worrying about, they're there for the work, right? They're there for the movement. They're there building community with each other. So the great thing about ATOM, which I really love, is that they were communicating with other anti-nuclear groups all across the Pacific by hand, by phone, by letter, right? Remember those things, like actually landlines and stuff like that, and actual like fax machines and things like that was like in the 80s. The fax was like speeding it up in the 90s. That was speeding it up. But they were making newsletters by hand on a mimeograph machine every month or every week, right? They were doing that in class, right, at USP, right? They were creating educational materials, and they were mailing things to people. They were standing out, and they were getting education out to thousands of folks by hand, by community, by having meetings. It's a very strange thing now because I'm sitting here, I'm like talking to a screen, telling the story of something that I would normally be telling in person, and that we should be telling in person, right? It's important because every time people wrote those letters and those notes by hand, right? And every time they put something in an envelope, every time they turned that machine, they were building community, and they were building critical consciousness around this issue. But more importantly, and most importantly, right, is they were creating solidarity. These guys worked with students, with community leaders, with political leaders, with trade unionists, with people all over the world. That's just this guy. This is just them. This is like think about this. You guys weren't even, like, many of us were on planet, right? Some of us were only babies then. This is how they were doing it. And they're in Fiji, right? And they're talking to people in the Cook Islands. They're talking about people in Kanaki. They're talking about people in Australia. They're talking to people in Hawaii. They're talking to people in Palau. They're talking to people in the Marshalls. That's organizing. Sending out a flyer on email, that's not organizing, right? Really connecting with people, physically connecting with people, that's organizing, right? And so and Suliana went on to be one of the major leaders, right, in this movement, right? She stayed with, and she's just one among many. There's Claire Slater, there's Vanessa Griffin, there's so many people who lead to people like Teresia Tewa, right? These are the building blocks for those folks that we so dearly cherish, right? Even Honani K. Trask was completely informed by by the beginning stages of these movements, right? When we get to the first nuclear free, it was at the first one was called Nuclear Free Pacific. We didn't throw in independent yet. It was, I want us to understand too, that it was inherent that independence was already part of that conversation, right? For Pacific people, self-determination was always like very clear and vivid, because we were in the middle of decolonizing at the time. People were pushing for decolonization and pushing for self-determination at the time, right? But why did we need to add the independent, right? Well, I'll tell you this, right? It's not like just the Pacific was concerned with nuclear testing. Nuclear testing was happening all over the world. Russia was doing it, right? The US was doing it in parts of the US, like in Nevada, like, you know, like nuclear testing was like a thing. Nuclear disarmament was a huge thing globally. But just like today's sort of climate change movement, you have folks who only want to look at this thing, but they don't want to look at the independence thing. They don't want to look at the self-determination thing. They wanted to just focus on the peace part, right? And the flowers and the thing, right? And disarming, but they didn't want to say that that disarmament has to happen on the terms of the indigenous, right? So that is why there was a shift and a push towards including nuclear free and independent Pacific in these conferences, in this movement, right? The first one happened, and this isn't even all, because the conferences went on and continue to go on into the 90s, and Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific is still an organization that exists today. One of the main concerns, though, is that as people got older, the movement aged with them, and we're not necessarily bringing everybody, like D-Mill did sort of stop being cool. We're going to make D-Mill cool again, okay? We're going to make anti-nuclear stuff cool again. And there's I'm going to talk a little bit about some organizations that are making that cool again, right? Because this was the thing, okay? This was very cool, hip, the best organizing you could do. Everybody was in NFIP. All the cool kids were in NFIP, right? If you were talking about organizing, if you were talking about shifting stuff, you were connected somehow with this movement, right? So the early movement, like, so it started out in Fiji, was the very first one. You had folks from, you had 90 people, right? Representing 85 different countries in the Pacific, right? And also there were people there from like Turtle Island. There were folks, right, from, like, you know, like First Nations folks from Canada, right? Like they were just all, right? There's a whole bunch of folks there. And like, if you can see, like this very first one, that's typed by hand, folks. That's a mimeograph. Most of you, some of you may not even know what I'm talking about, but that was typed by hand. That was typed by hand. I love that, right? This is like, you know, this is like almost like a hand-drawn map, okay? I think it was, and they just kind of mimeographed it, right? And then you start getting fancy and you start putting photos in later, right? In the 80s, right? You start getting fancy. You see Fiji, you see Pohnpei, you see Hawaii. It comes to Hawaii in 1980, and you see Vanuatu. Vanuatu is a major one. Vanuatu, in terms of Hawaii, you had folks there like Ku'ule Me Aloha Gomes, you had Colette Machado, you had Daviana McGregor was there. You had some heavy players up in that by 1983, right? So we're seeing this relationship, right? We're seeing people flying to Fiji, flying to Vanuatu, flying to Pohnpei, right? Coming to Hawaii. And in the middle of this time, right? Let me see what my next slide is, right? Right, so like I was saying, it's a regional movement. Solidarity, right? So you've got Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Kanaki, which is New Caledonia, West Papua, Papua New Guinea, right? what are the other islands? I can't even see all my things. Cook Islands, Tuvalu, Samoa, Tonga, Tuataete Ma, Tuamotu, Marquesas, Tupua'i, Aotearoa, Hawaii, Palau, Kiribati, Guam, Northern Marianas, right? Marshall Islands, Pohnpei, Australia, Niue, and East Timor, just to name a few. Not to mention the Philippines, First Nations in Canada, Japan, some people in Japan and South Korea. There was even some folks from Denmark that showed up to one of the conference. This is huge. Now, how many people do you know can organize? I mean, I have a hard time organizing people for a dinner party on my island in my neighborhood, like on a Saturday. Like, these are folks organizing, loosely organizing. There are chapters of NFIP in every part of the Pacific. And in the 1970s and 80s, the relationship in Hawaii between, right, Hawaiians and Micronesians around this issue was monumental, right? We were united in self-determination. We were united in demilitarization. We were united, right, in ending war and nuclear testing in the Pacific. So I don't know where we've come right now. We've lost our way a little bit, because when I look at this time period, the amount of love that existed between Pacific peoples was very clear and vivid, right? The organizing that took place was incredible. And another thing that's really important to note is that it was super grassroots. People were really committed to learning about each other, defending each other, flying to each other's countries, going to, like, sponsoring each other for conferences, right? NFIP worked with PKO to stop the bombing in Kaho'olawe for Cancel RIMPAC in 1984. In Hawaii Island, they managed to, I'll talk about it later. Actually, I'm gonna get to that a little bit later, right? NFIP was one of the first people to put West Papua as an issue on the map. NFIP was among those folks who were defending East Timor, right? NFIP was among those folks who were fighting against the kangaroo operations happening in Australia, right? NFIP was invested in self-determination in the Kanaki, right? With New Caledonia, right? With the Kanaks of New Caledonia, with West Papua, with Hawaiian sovereignty, with the sovereignty of Guahan, right? Palau, Marshall Islands, and all of Micronesia. There was resistance to the Compact of Free Association, and I'll talk about that a little bit, right? These are really important things, because here we are, we're not connected by internet. We're not connected, right? We're literally getting on. I mean, some people may not remember the planes of the 70s and 80s. They were a little different. It was a little bit harder to get around, right? But we were building these relationships, physically building these relationships. We were fighting together. I'm not saying it was all, I mean, we definitely had fights, right? We definitely have fight, right? That's what you do. We were disagreeing. We were in what we call principled struggle together, right? We were there building consciousness, and we were clear that a US occupation, that a British occupation, that a French occupation, right, was unacceptable. Why have we lost that clarity is the question that I have often. When we understand how close we were, right? Just not like, a little over 30 years ago. It's really not that long. When we talk about History Day, I'm like, for me, that's like 5 minutes ago, right? I was in high school when this stuff was happening, right? So like, I was like, why was I not older and involved in this? Why was I not doing this, right? I'm really jealous that I wasn't there for some of this, because the conferences that happened in this time were life-changing. The rallies, right? Let me break it down. In Australia, 1984, they had a 250,000 per person march. I mean, right? 250,000 people marched. 125 of those were in Sydney alone, okay? To protest French testing, right? to protest nuclear testing, to tell Australia not to have nuclear testing in their waters or to accept nuclear arms or any of that, right? 250,000 people. Do you see how big this movement is? And not only that, the US was so threatened by this, right? Was so threatened by the groundswell, by the grassroots movement of this, the energy of this, that the FBI was like, they were like, this is a great threat to the United States. They were like trying to mess with it. To me, once the United States is like, you're a total threat to us, then we're doing something, right? You're shifting. There was so much pressure being put on the countries. Like, so in 1984, when NFIP worked with PKO to try to cancel RIMPAC in 1984, Australia, Japan, and Aotearoa all pulled out from bombing Kaʻolave that year. Of course, US and Canada, they went ahead and did their thing, right? But I want you to think about that kind of pressure. And then when the Canadian First Nation folks and the Canadian peace activists found out about Canada's involvement, they went after them. And it was to the point where Canada was like, I don't know if we should even do this anymore. I don't know, right? So imagine, that's a lot of power. Think about how much power that is, right? The charter that came out of the first nuclear-free Pacific conference was, this is kind of the opening statement. We, the people of the Pacific, have been victimized too long by foreign powers. The Western imperialistic and colonial powers invaded our defenseless region. They took over our lands and subjugated our people to their whims. This form of alien colonial, political, and military domination unfortunately persists as an evil cancer in some of our native territories, such as Tahiti, Polynesia, Kanaki, Australia, and Aotearoa. Our environment continues to be despoiled by foreign powers developing nuclear weapons for a strategy of warfare that has no winners, no liberators, and imperils the survival of all mankind, of humankind. Wow, that was how they kicked off, right? I want you to think about this too, because the people who made that little statement, the majority of them were like in college. They were like in their 20s. Okay, they're in their 20s and 30s. Okay, so this is a big deal. This is a big deal. This is in the middle of organizing against Vietnam. This is in the middle of the rise of Black power. This isn't right. So they're also showing solidarity against apartheid. They're also showing solidarity with the rise of Black power happening in the South Pacific, right? All of these movements are informing each other. So anyway, so like there's also this incredible cultural production happening. You see all these handmade posters. You see all of these amazing hand-drawn things that are happening by everyday people. And they're walking around and they're making this and they're sharing this with their friends, right? The nuclear-free constitutions, I just want, before I run out of time, Palau was the first ever, right? And of course I have a military helicopter flying over me right now, right, when this is happening. Right, so in 1979, 92% of the Palauan people voted for their nuclear-free constitution, which included a clause requiring 75% of voters to agree before nuclear weapons could be brought into Palau. It's the first time that clause of banning or restricting nuclear activities has ever been included in a constitution anywhere in the world, and the achievement has not been repeated since. So the first people to ban nuclear testing in their constitution are Micronesian from Palau, right? And I'm just gonna add a kicker to that. This woman over here on your right, who was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2005, Gabriela Ingermain, was a Mirer of Koror, was instrumental in giving the world its first, she was a key player in this, okay? She led this organization called Otil Ab Balau, which is Anchor of the Land women's organization, for 50 years. And she never stopped organizing, okay? And she was one of the people that was like, what are y'all doing with the Compact of Free Association? This basically gives the US permission to come back and take our lands anytime they like. Know that you're committing to this forever when you sign this, right? That's right? So I mean, imagine having that kind of clarity, right? So other people followed suit. Vanuatu got a nuclear-free constitution in 1982, or right, Solomon Islands, and then in the Treaty of Rarotonga in 1985, right, you had nuclear-free zones, the creation of nuclear-free zones, and they had to twist Australia's arm to do it. They waited a whole year, and Nauru waited until 1987, right? You see all these people creating, right, through this movement, through that pressure, through the theater, through organized, through rallies. They put so much pressure on the Pacific that look at this list of people who created nuclear-free zones. Hawaii Island actually had a nuclear-free zone in 1981, which somehow the US military actually was able to take back in 84. Okay, so Pakuloa and all those places that should not be, right? So I just want to close with, this is the beginning. This is the folks from Adam that was marching in Suva in 1970. Today, this is like folks in Fiji in an organization called Young Solwara. They have a campaign called the Nuclear Ways. And they're still continuing this legacy. They're still continuing that fight. And there's some resources, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I know I went too long, I'm sorry.
No, it was a powerful and illuminating presentation. For those that are joining us, we will open up